I guess I'm probably best known at home on the prairie because my best-selling book is called If You're Not From the Prairie, and it's sold a ton of books. And then I wrote a second book called Prairie Born, and then I wrote a book called Happy Centennial Saskatchewan, and a book about the Qu'Appelle Valley. So all of a sudden I was writing these books about home, and I was using artists who are prairie people. Alan Sapp is the most well-known Cree, I was going to say living artist, but Mr. Sapp died a few years ago. Michael and Ken Lonechild, the great Chinese artist Wan Sun Yan. So I've worked with a number of these artists, and so subsequently people on the prairie tend to know me, and so I'm headed home to Regina tomorrow. If somebody would have said to me years ago, you can make a living doing what you loved best, I'd have said, what is that? And they said, well, what do you like to do? I said, I'm interested in people, and I'm interested in life. And Trevor, my issues go all the way back to kindergarten when I was 4 years old, and my teacher looked at me in Gravelbourg, Saskatchewan, and said, Bouchard, veux-tu taire? Bouchard, do you want to stop talking? And I said, no, ma soeur. And that's a mistake you only make once, is saying no to an oblate nun. Phew. And then, of course, in grade 4, again, it was tais-toi, which is pretty serious, don't talk. And in grade 9, it went on. For me, I was always getting in trouble because my passion is people and stories, and I really don't care about the big things in the world. I want to know, who are you? Where do you come from? And who's that with you? And where, that kind of thing. So I'm that person, when you get to the airport, I stop strangers to talk to them because I'm interested. And it's a sincere interest. So we're storytellers. So for me, I guess it started years ago when I wrote a book called Whitetail Don't Live in the City. And I wrote it because I met a young First Nation artist called Ken Lonechild, and his art was amazing. And I said, Ken, I'm going to write a short story for my students, and I'll take some of your paintings. And we did it, and it was published in Winnipeg a lifetime ago. And that was a first. And then I moved to BC, and I wrote a book called If You're Not From the Prairie. And it was the book that opened the doors for me. It was because it was right there in my heart, and no one else had seen it yet. But when I got to BC, I said, friends, you think you know weather? I got to tell you. And so we just one of those typical examples. Trevor, if you're not the prairie, you don't know cold. You think you know cold? Do you know what to do to relieve the pain? It's a burning from deep down. It drives us insane. Our ears through our fingers right into our toes, because a child who's been cold on the prairie will know. And all of the memories we share when we get old, there's not one that's more clear to us than hard, bitter cold. You'll never find among us a soul who can say, hey, I've conquered the wind on a cold winter's day. If you're not from the prairie, do you know that cold? No, you don't. So I went through all of the elements of nature in that book, and finally I said, that's who I am. I'm a prairie boy. Our lives and our characters are molded by Mother Nature. In Vancouver, they're molded by the bridges. In Toronto, it's the 401, the 427, the highways. But folks didn't know that, so I finally had to say, if you're not the prairie, you don't know me. You see, you just can't know me. My hair is mostly wind. My eyes, they're filled with grit. My skin is white or brown, my lips chapped and split. I've lain on the prairie and I've actually heard grasses sigh. I stared at the vast open bowl of the sky. I've seen every castle and face in the clouds. My home was the prairie. For that, I'm so proud. So when I find, when I write something, sometimes it's dictated by the illustrator. So I saw the work of Gordon Miller, and I thought, okay, I want to write a book around what he does. I want to illustrate his art through my art, through my poetry. Roy Henry Vickers is from Vancouver Island, and when I first saw Roy's art, I examined the paintings, I studied the paintings, and I know what he's trying to say. So I wrote a book called The Elders Are Watching. They say you're hunting for the thrill of the kill. First it was the buffalo, and now it's the bear. They say you know how few there are left, and yet so many of you don't seem to care. They got no problem with fishing for sport. Come on, there's a lot of fish in the lakes and the sea. It's for the few of you who are wasting your catch. For you, they've come and they're speaking through me. They told me to tell you the time has come. They want you to know how they feel. Listen carefully and look toward the sun. The elders are watching you. When it came to others, I discovered the work of Wan Sun Yan, who now lives in Regina, and I looked at his art and I thought, oh my. So it was through my passion for his art that I did 5 books with Yang. on China, and he had to teach me a lot of that because so little did I know. And then I guess Trevor and all, maybe I've worked with 30 different artists, and I've been lucky enough to say to my publishers, and I've worked with maybe 10 publishers, I want this artist to do this book, period. And I've already talked to the artist in their game, and this is what we're going to do. So my upcoming book, my most recent, is a book being published in Winnipeg. And the illustrator I found, I think, on the internet, looking at different things, and she's a Métis girl from Ontario. And I just love what Jessica does. So I said to the publisher, I will give you this book to publish. Here's the story, and here's the girl that's going to do it. And so it's called The Talking Stick, and it's coming out, I hope, this month. Well, let me start with the artist. I have a very, very close friend in Regina, Saskatchewan, who was the master professor at the largest university in China, the University of Guangzhou. And Yan lived through the Mao Revolution. And when he came out of that, he came around not as a professor at the University of Guangzhou, but as the master professor. And Yang has his work sell across the globe for significant amounts of money. He's just incredible. And we fell in love. I mean, I just love Yan. And we did together a series of books, 5 books. The Great Race, talking about the Chinese zodiac, and he had to teach me that. I'm a dragon. And then we talked about dragon boat racing, The Mermaid's Muse. And we did one about the Chinese New Year. Why do they make all these loud noises and bright lights and fireworks? And then I did a book with Yang called Buddha in the Garden, and loved it. And then he had a huge show in Taipei. It sold out in a matter of minutes. A massive show about the last empress of China, Cixi. And he came home and said, David, you make a book about Cixi. I said, yeah, I know nothing about Cixi. He said, you're a smart man, I will teach you. So sure enough, I have a whole series of books by Dare Lin, who was her lady-in-waiting. And I learned a lot about her, and we did a book called Dragon of Heaven. That was our 5th. And then Yan, while he was here with me working on that 5th book and Raincoast Books out of Vancouver, we started to talk about a picture that I had of our home here in Victoria. And it was 2 men who worked for, 2 Chinese men who worked as house workers for Francis Rattenbury. And he looked at the pictures and he said, what's the story here? And I said, oh, yeah, and it's probably not something you want to talk about, because the house I lived in was built by Rattenbury at the time. He had built a house, he and Samuel McClure, and it was a massive, massive stone house in Oak Bay. And we had a room in our home that was referred to as the Chinaman's room. And Yan said, oh. I said, yeah, and they weren't really welcome in the rest of the house. They worked in the house and in the garden. And so we talked about some of the I guess really the abuses and some of the racism that we as Canadians are guilty of. And he and I started talking about what could we do to kind of enlighten the world to that. That was years and years ago. And then time passed, and as Truth and Reconciliation came to pass, I thought that's certainly true about we as Indigenous people, but it's also true about the Asian element in our country. How we as Canadians are not holier than thou. And whenever I hear someone look at the U.S. and say, look, you racists, I say, hey, you go look in the mirror before you start throwing stones. Let me tell you about what we did. And at that point, Yan was so wanting to commit to that, he said, you do that. Okay, so that idea was in there. So we're going to do a book that will expose the truth about how we Canadians are, I think in many ways are still guilty of racism and of bigotry and of generally not being kind to one another. And so the idea was born. And I said, Yan, do you want to do this book? And he said, David, my son just graduated in fine arts. Would you do it with Sean? I said, well, I'd love to. And he said, he does it on the computer. And I said, let's see what he can do. Oh my, and when the publisher saw it, she said, that's phenomenal. So thus came I Am Not a Ghost, a story that would talk about how we as Canadians invited these Chinese to come to Canada and work. They had to pay their own fare. And when they got here, they had to pay to work. And they were paid exactly 1/2 of what a Canadian white person was paid. And when all of the dirty jobs came to pass, they were given the blasting in the mountains and all of that. And for every mile of railroad between Vancouver and Calgary, there's one dead Chinese laborer. And our kids should know about that, because when our kids know they're the future of our generation. These are good kids. They will make decisions that had I been told that as a boy, I might have made different decisions. Our society might have been different. But sometimes we just keep the truth from them, and I don't know why. So that book came to be. And one of the real interesting pieces of this is Mr. Louis, H.J. Louis, who the Louis family. His grandpa was one of those immigrants. And when he read the book, he said, I want people to know this. Mr. Lewis, you probably know, owns the London Drugs in our country, and he owns Loblaws or he's a very well-to-do man. He said, what I'd like to do is I'd like to buy 2 copies of that book and put it in every library in Western Canada. Every school library will have 2 copies of the book. Well, that was just such a plug. You know, it's got nothing to do with the finances. It's got everything to do with what's right.